Renovation Revelation. In the spring of 1847, a team of workers in Milfield, Ohio, undertook the routine renovation of a long-abandoned church nestled on the edge of a crumbling frontier town. The church had once been a modest house of worship, but had since fallen into disrepair, its warped floorboards and collapsed roof a quiet testament to time's relentless passage. Among the workers was Joseph Harkins, a master carpenter with decades of experience. He and his crew were assigned to dismantle the deteriorated pulpit, an intricately carved structure rumored to have been crafted by hand more than 40 years earlier. As they began removing its panels, Harkins noticed something strange. A hollow echo behind one section that shouldn't have been there. Upon closer inspection, he uncovered a hidden compartment sealed with an elaborate mechanical latch, rusted but still functional. With deliberate care, they broke the seal and opened the space. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its surface worn, smooth by time, the corners curled with age, yet the pages within were astonishingly well preserved. The journal wasn't merely an old relic, it was a chilling record. Every page was filled with neat, controlled handwriting cataloging over 8,000 deaths. Each entry included a name, a date, a cause of death, and most unsettling of all property values, and assessed financial worth. This wasn't a record of loss or remembrance. It was a business ledger. Harkins, who would later testify to local authorities, described being overcome with a sense of dread as he flipped through the pages. "It felt," he said, "like I was reading the balance sheets of hell." The sense of sanctity one might expect from church records was entirely absent. Instead, the cold precision of the entries' deaths, neatly quantified, and assets tabulated, evoked a terrifying image of death commodified, catalogued, and calculated. In that instant, the church ceased to be a place of salvation. It had become a vault of horror. The grim maps. Lying beside the journal in the hidden compartment was a collection of 15 maps, each one drawn with painstaking detail. The parchment had faded, but the ink remained bold enough to read. These were no ordinary geographical references. Each map corresponded to a specific settlement across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, bearing ominous annotations in the same meticulous handwriting as the journal. Topographical features were carefully noted: swamplands, flood zones, marshes, and forested areas. Beside these features were notations that chilled the blood: seasonal fever, pattern high June-August. Expected mortality 60% in year 1. Asset recovery rate projected 85%. At the top corner of each map, scrawled in ink that had bled slightly with time, was a single haunting phrase: the promised land. These maps told a story no sermon ever would, a systematic effort to steer followers into locations where nature itself became a silent executioner. It was clear that the creators of these documents had studied death not as a tragedy, but as a tool. The geography wasn't chosen for abundance or beauty. It was chosen for its lethality. Settlements were marked not by opportunity, but by their fatal features. These were engineered environments for suffering. And the maps' cartographic blueprints of orchestrated demise suggested a chilling degree of forethought. It was as if a divine calling had been inverted into a business plan. When authorities later analyzed the terrain of the identified regions, they confirmed the lethal conditions noted on the maps. This was no tragic accident born of poor farming decisions or bad luck. It was calculated exploitation, dressed in the robes of prophecy, the vanishing evidence In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, church officials, clearly disturbed by the find, contacted the local sheriff, William Blackwood. Blackwood, known for his no-nonsense approach and deep ties to the community, arrived at the church that same evening. After thoroughly inspecting the journal and maps, he locked them inside a secure cabinet in his office and ordered 2 deputies to remain on duty overnight. The materials, he declared, would be transported to the state capital the following morning for further investigation. But when Blackwood arrived at his office the next day, the cabinet stood open, its contents gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no explanation from the deputies, who insisted nothing unusual had occurred during their watch. The journal and maps had simply vanished. The implication was staggering someone with intimate knowledge of the sheriff's office, and perhaps connections beyond had intervened. 3 days later, Sheriff Blackwood was found dead in his home. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but the circumstances raised countless questions. His house had not been broken into, yet his body was discovered in bed, his face twisted in an expression of pure horror. Rumors quickly spread that his skin bore strange discoloration, and his eyes remained locked open as if he'd seen something unspeakable in his final moments. The deputy who found him, Thomas Reed, resigned within a week and fled the state entirely. He refused for the remainder of his life to speak of what he had seen. Whatever had transpired in the days following the discovery, it became evident that this was not a simple case of lost documents. Someone had gone to great lengths to suppress the truth, and they were willing to kill to do it. The whispered legacy. The tale of the Westbrook family and the hidden church ledger became the stuff of frontier legend in Milfield. Over the ensuing decades, the story morphed into whispers, traded in hushed tones at the town's lone tavern, in the corners of back rooms and over candlelit kitchen tables. Most dismissed it as folklore, one of those ghost stories rural America seemed to breed. But others, especially older residents, swore it was all true. They remembered the day Sheriff Blackwood was buried with no autopsy and the way his coffin was nailed shut in haste. They recalled the way the church, once a site of spiritual renewal, was boarded up and left untouched until it finally collapsed in a storm in 1863. What few realized was that the journal found in 1847 was not the beginning of the story. It was the evidence of something far older, far deeper. The Westbrook name, it turned out, had long been associated with strange disappearances, unexplained illnesses, and the rapid collapse of settlements throughout the Ohio Valley. Until the journal emerged, these had only been circumstantial, a convergence of bad luck, frontier hardship, and the dangers of unregulated settlement. But now, with names, dates, causes of death, and financial figures recorded so deliberately, those scattered rumors found terrifying coherence. What had once seemed like disconnected tragedies began to align into a pattern, a web of religious manipulation, fraudulent land speculation, and quiet mass death. And at the center of that web always stood the Westbrook's men of God, who had perhaps been nothing more than merchants of death cloaked in Scripture. The discovery in 1847 cracked open the tomb of a buried truth. And for the first time, the whispers had weight. The Second Great Awakening. To understand the rise of the Westbrook brothers, one must first grasp the spiritual climate of early 19th century America. The period between the late 1790s and mid-1830s witnessed what historians call the Second Great Awakening, a massive wave of religious revivalism that swept across the burgeoning nation. It was a movement born out of uncertainty and promise. The United States was still a young republic defined by frontier expansion, democratic experimentation, and a hunger for moral order. Against this backdrop, itinerant preachers traversed vast rural landscapes, igniting fervor in hearts and minds, with passionate sermons on salvation, sin, and the imminent return of Christ. Camp meetings held in open fields or under large tents drew thousands of people who would travel for days to experience what they believed to be direct communion with the divine. These gatherings were not merely spiritual events. They were deeply emotional spectacles. Attendees often wept openly, collapsed in ecstasy, or spoke in tongues. Religious conversion became not only a personal transformation, but a communal experience of purification and renewal. For settlers living in isolation or hardship, these revivals offered community direction and hope. It was in this environment that fringe doctrines found fertile ground. With no centralized ecclesiastical authority on the frontier and minimal government oversight, religious movements flourished with astonishing speed and variety. While many of these groups were sincere in their pursuit of faith, others, like the one spearheaded by the Westbrook brothers, saw in the chaos a unique opportunity for manipulation. The religious awakening had opened hearts. Now it would also open wallets. Religious opportunism, the very conditions that made the frontier ripe for spiritual rebirth, also made it dangerously vulnerable to exploitation. In towns where churches had yet to be built and scripture came second-hand through traveling preachers, charismatic figures could rise quickly and without much scrutiny. Anyone with a convincing voice, a command of biblical language, and a magnetic presence could establish themselves as a religious authority. For many frontier families whose lives were defined by physical labor and existential uncertainty, these men provided meaning, guidance, and community. But without any established system of oversight or accountability, there was little to stop a preacher from leveraging that influence for darker purposes. The line between prophecy and fraud was often razor-thin. Where one preacher offered visions of salvation, another might embed those visions with instructions to invest in land, contribute gold for the church's construction, or relocate to sacred ground under dubious promises of divine favor. Land sales, tithes, and property pledges were common features of these emerging ministries. In many cases, entire communities uprooted themselves based on a charismatic leader's word alone. The Westbrooks understood this vulnerability deeply. They didn't just present themselves as spiritual leaders. They positioned themselves as gatekeepers to a new Eden where suffering was rebranded as sanctification and obedience as the currency of eternal reward. Their operation succeeded not in spite of religious fervor, but because of it. Ohio, as a frontier canvas. By the early 1800s, Ohio had become the embodiment of American frontier potential. Admitted to the Union in 1803, it represented both a literal and symbolic gateway to the West. The state's population exploded as land-hungry families, religious communities, and failed merchants sought new beginnings on its untamed terrain. From just over 45,000 residents in 1800, Ohio's population soared to over 500,000 by 1820. Towns sprang up almost overnight, often without formal governance, infrastructure, or law enforcement. In this chaotic atmosphere, opportunists thrived. Swindlers and speculators sold uninhabitable land to unsuspecting settlers, while self-proclaimed prophets gathered congregations eager for certainty in an unstable world. Ohio's physical geography, dense forests, meandering rivers, malaria-prone valleys, only heightened the drama of its social experimentation. Here the soil was as rich as it was dangerous, and every tree chopped down was a gamble between fortune and fever. The state's spiritual terrain mirrored its physical, one wild, unregulated, and teeming with possibility. It was into this ferment that the Westbrook brothers stepped. Unlike many who came west to farm or trade, they arrived with a different commodity belief. Their timing was impeccable. The people of Ohio were ready to listen, to follow, and to give. All they needed was a voice, promising them that their struggle was holy and that their reward was just beyond the next bend in the river. Isaiah Westbrook offered them that voice and then led them to their doom. Religious innovation or calculated fraud. In the beginning, the Westbrooks movement was indistinguishable from dozens of other fledgling frontier congregations. Their language was biblical, their practices familiar, and their theology at first glance orthodox, enough to escape suspicion. Isaiah Westbrook quoted liberally from Scripture, hosted revivals, and encouraged strict moral conduct among his followers. His sermons focused on purity, divine selection, and the promise of a new spiritual homeland, concepts that resonated with the revival culture of the time. But underneath the pious surface was a tightly engineered machine designed not for salvation, but for profit. Every aspect of the brothers' operation, from Daniel's theological writings to Samuel's legal contracts, was orchestrated to appear righteous while facilitating mass exploitation. What set the Westbrooks apart was their understanding of optics. They never positioned themselves as outsiders or radicals. Instead, they mirrored mainstream Christian practices just closely enough to avoid scrutiny. The settlements they created featured familiar rituals, traditional hymns, and disciplined community life. But these were merely trappings. Beneath them lurked carefully chosen land plots, guaranteed to fail contracts with hidden clauses and death rates that far exceeded those of surrounding communities. Their manipulation worked because it cloaked itself in respectability. It was not the fiery zealot in the wilderness who posed the greatest danger in early 19th century America. It was the calm, well-spoken prophet who knew exactly how to speak the language of hope while preparing the machinery of betrayal. A charismatic arrival. In the spring of 1803, as Ohio celebrated its new status as the 17th state in the Union, a tall, bearded man disembarked from a weather-worn wagon in the bustling town of Chillicothe. His name was Isaiah Westbrook, a failed merchant from Hartford, Connecticut, whose past business ventures had ended in debt and quiet disgrace. But here, amid the muddy streets and wide-eyed settlers of the Ohio frontier, Isaiah introduced himself not as a tradesman, but as a man called by God. Standing over 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and a voice as rich as thunder rolled in velvet, Isaiah commanded attention without effort. He had no formal pulpit yet, but when he climbed atop a crate in the town square and began to speak of visions and divine purpose, people gathered instinctively. His words, both grand and intimate, touched the emotional nerves of those struggling to survive in a harsh new land. Isaiah claimed to have been led to Ohio by a divine vision, one that painted the wilderness as a blank canvas on which God's true church could be restored. The East has grown bloated with pride, he told early listeners. But here in the unspoiled wild, we may build anew. To weary farmers and disillusioned settlers, his message was electrifying. He promised not only spiritual revival, but a sense of belonging, a sacred mission that imbued their daily toil with cosmic meaning. The idea of starting fresh, of forging a holy community far from the corruption of old cities, appealed deeply to his audience. Within weeks, Isaiah had begun attracting a loyal following, many of whom referred to him not as a preacher, but as a prophet. And as the crowds grew, so did his ambition. Formation of the faithful, of the new promise. By the end of that summer, Isaiah Westbrook's sermons were drawing crowds from neighboring counties. What began as impromptu gatherings soon evolved into organized services, held under open skies or in hastily built meeting houses. His message, a blend of revivalist Christianity and mystic revelation, centered on the idea of a divine remnant, a chosen people who would inherit a promised land if they remained faithful and obedient. This narrative, drawn in part from Old Testament language, gave Isaiah's followers a collective identity that transcended individual hardship. They were not just settlers. They were instruments of prophecy, chosen to fulfill a sacred plan. And Isaiah, their anointed guide, was the conduit through which God's voice now spoke. The group that coalesced around him began calling themselves the faithful of the new promise. Their belief system was deliberately structured to evoke both familiarity and exclusivity. Isaiah retained key elements of mainstream Protestantism such as baptism, scriptural reading, and communal prayer, while introducing his own revelations as divinely inspired supplements. He taught that the world was approaching a great spiritual reckoning, and that those outside the new promise would soon fall into ruin. More dangerously, he began to speak of specific geographic locations that God had set aside for his chosen flock, hidden Edens awaiting the faithful. These were not vague metaphors. Isaiah spoke with unnerving specificity about rivers, valleys, and wooded hills, where God's blessings would flow like milk and honey. Few among his listeners realized that these promised lands corresponded to properties already acquired by his brothers. Manipulation through mysticism. What made Isaiah's message so compelling was not merely its content, but the way he delivered it. According to journal entries from early followers, there was something unnerving about his gaze, an intensity that made people feel seen, known, even exposed. One such account came from Hannah Weathers, a school teacher, who would later flee one of the doomed settlements. When Reverend Westbrook speaks, she wrote, it is as though he can look into your soul and find the question you've never spoken aloud. And then he answers it with perfect clarity. Isaiah's oratory had a hypnotic effect. He was capable of holding hundreds in rapt silence for hours, weaving scripture with personal visions in a manner that felt both transcendent and urgent. He spoke of spiritual battles in unseen realms, of purification through hardship, and of divine rewards just beyond reach, if only his people remained obedient. This deeply personal approach forged an emotional dependency between Isaiah and his followers. Doubt was not just skepticism, it was a form of betrayal. And so as his congregation grew, so did their willingness to suspend critical thought. Families sold homes, abandoned farms, and pooled their resources to follow Isaiah's into wilderness outposts that he claimed had been divinely revealed. The theology he preached was perfectly tailored to frontier psychology. It valorized suffering, framed risk as a test of faith, and discouraged questioning by labeling it as spiritual weakness. This manipulation was intentional. Isaiah's mystical charisma wasn't a side effect of his calling, it was the cornerstone of a grand design. And while his followers saw a prophet of God, his brothers Daniel and Samuel saw something else, a golden goose cloaked in scripture. The machinery. Behind the vision, Isaiah was never alone in his enterprise. Unbeknownst to most of his early followers, his younger brothers Daniel and Samuel had quietly preceded him to Ohio, arriving months earlier under assumed names. Their task was to scout and acquire land parcels, often ones dismissed by locals as worthless due to poor soil flooding or disease. They paid pennies on the dollar using funds siphoned from their failed mercantile ventures in Connecticut. Isaiah's sermons about New Edens were conveniently aligned with these acquisitions. As he stirred crowds with divine pronouncements, Daniel and Samuel ensured that the logistics deeds titles, construction plans were already in place. It was a symphony of manipulation. Isaiah inspired faith. Daniel justified it with doctrine, and Samuel monetized it. Each brother played a distinct role. Daniel, a former divinity student with a talent for writing, produced dense theological texts that wrapped their schemes in a veil of scriptural legitimacy. Samuel trained in carpentry, and legal work handled the financial infrastructure, contracts, purchases, and later property reclamations. Together they formed a closed triangle of authority with no room for dissent. Their brilliance lay in how seamlessly they blended the sacred and the secular, cloaking calculated fraud and the language of revival. To their congregants they appeared as a holy trinity of purpose. But in truth they were building not a church, but a machine, one fueled by trust, driven by doctrine, and lubricated with blood. Daniel, the theologian, Daniel Westbrook, the middle brother, was the mind behind the movement's spiritual scaffolding. Though less charismatic than Isaiah, Daniel played a critical role in legitimizing their operation. He had briefly studied theology at Yale Divinity School before financial troubles forced his withdrawal, but those short years in academic circles gave him a lifelong command of biblical language, rhetorical technique, and doctrinal construction. Daniel knew how to write in a way that felt sacred, dense enough to impress, vague enough to avoid contradiction. With Isaiah providing the divine vision, Daniel was tasked with transforming inspiration into ideology. He authored dozens of treatises that blended traditional Protestant themes with newer revelations attributed to Isaiah. These writings, circulated in pamphlets and read aloud during services, helped justify nearly every decision the movement made, from relocation to land acquisition to communal labor. What made Daniel especially dangerous was his talent for cloaking coercion in Scripture. His texts introduced concepts like progressive revelation, the belief that God continuously reveals new truths through his prophets, and covenantal purification, a theological idea that suffering in the Promised Land was a sign of divine testing, not environmental misjudgment. These doctrines were subtly structured to silence dissent. If one questioned Isaiah, one questioned God. If one hesitated to move to a new settlement, one lacked faith. Daniel's authority came not from his voice, but from his pen. And because few of their rural followers were literate, his texts carried an almost mystical weight, passed from preacher to pulpit as divine gospel. By building a belief system that rewarded obedience and pathologized doubt, Daniel effectively trapped thousands in a self-reinforcing spiritual prison, a doctrine carefully engineered to serve the brothers' financial machine. Samuel, the executor. While Isaiah inspired and Daniel interpreted, it was Samuel, the youngest brother, who executed. Cold, meticulous, and emotionally detached, Samuel rarely preached or wrote. He didn't need to. His domain was property law, financial maneuvering, and the practical side of building a religious empire. Trained as a carpenter and self-taught in frontier legal tactics, Samuel orchestrated the acquisition and resale of land with ruthless precision. He was the one who handled transactions, wrote contracts, negotiated purchases, and structured settlement layouts. And when the inevitable deaths occurred, whether from malaria, starvation, or exposure, he was the one who reclaimed the land, often through legal covenants buried deep in contracts drafted under the guise of spiritual commitment. Samuel's brilliance lay in how seamlessly he integrated religious vocabulary into property agreements. Settlers were often asked to sign covenants of faith which, while sounding like spiritual pledges, were in fact legal documents transferring ownership of land back to the church if the family died or left. In the eyes of the state, that church was controlled by Samuel. He kept detailed ledgers cataloging not only deaths and property values, but patterns, mortality rates, asset recovery, timelines, average time to community collapse. These weren't the records of a pastor or even a real estate agent. They were the accounting of a strategist who viewed human suffering as a variable in a business equation. Samuel was not consumed by religious ideology. He was consumed by optimization, and he refined their model with each new promised land, improving the yield by adjusting site selection, recruitment patterns, and timing. In another life, he might have been a railroad tycoon or industrial magnate. In this life, he chose God's name as his brand, a failed prototype. The Westbrook's mastery of manipulation wasn't born in Ohio, it was perfected there. 2 years before their arrival in the Midwest, the brothers had attempted a smaller version of their scheme in Rhode Island. There, posing as a revivalist group, they established a short-lived religious settlement built on a rented parcel of farmland. At the time, their methods were less refined. The theology lacked coherence, the land was not legally owned, and the leadership structure was too openly centralized. After just 18 months, the community collapsed amid accusations of mismanagement and financial impropriety. Several members alleged they had been pressured to donate assets under false pretenses, and local newspapers ran scathing editorials accusing the group of fraud. Legal proceedings were initiated, but before formal charges could be filed, the Westbrooks vanished, leaving behind unpaid debts, broken contracts, and a trail of unanswered questions. This early failure, however, was not wasted. In fact, it became a crucial learning experience. From it, the brothers learned 3 things. First, that property must be legally secured and held in layers of protection to avoid seizure. Second, that theology must be sophisticated enough to withstand public scrutiny and internal doubt. And third, that isolation was critical, both geographic and social. In Rhode Island, proximity to established institutions had invited scrutiny. In Ohio, the frontier's wild openness provided the distance they needed. When they next re-emerged, it was with new names, new papers, and a much more complex operation. Their theology was now tightly scripted. Their followers were carefully selected. Their assets were distributed through proxies and shell organizations. Rhode Island had been their rehearsal. Ohio would be the main performance, the Trinitarian structure. Together, Isaiah, Daniel, and Samuel functioned as a closed, self-reinforcing trinity. Each brother embodied a different facet of their collective scheme, and none could have operated alone with the same level of success. Isaiah provided the inspiration and visibility. Daniel provided the intellectual legitimacy. Samuel provided the logistics and legal shield. Their success lay not just in their individual skills, but in the near-perfect way they complemented each other. Followers who were moved by Isaiah's sermons would be handed Daniel's writings to study, and if they committed to joining a promised land settlement, they would sign paperwork drafted by Samuel. Every stage of the process, recruitment, indoctrination, relocation, and extraction, was synchronized like the cogs of a machine. This structure also made it nearly impossible for outsiders to dismantle the organization. Each brother operated in a different domain. If one were questioned, the others could deflect or deny knowledge. Even among their followers, the brothers carefully curated their appearances. Isaiah was the face of the movement, always present and spiritually invested. Daniel was the scholar rarely seen but often quoted. Samuel was a ghost, known by name but seldom encountered. To most congregants, the three Westbrooks existed in mythic harmony, symbols of divine alignment rather than co-conspirators. But beneath that illusion was a business model engineered to exploit religious longing, real estate speculation, and legal ambiguity on a massive scale. Their operation was not a ministry, it was a corporation, investments. The promised land announcement. In January 1805, as the winter winds howled through the hills of southeastern Ohio, Isaiah Westbrook stood behind the newly constructed pulpit of the modest wooden church in Milfield and delivered what would become his most fateful sermon. Dressed in black wool and illuminated by lantern light, Isaiah proclaimed to his congregation that he had received a new vision, one more vivid and urgent than any before. There is a land, he said, his voice echoing off the frost-covered walls, not 30 miles from this very place that God has set aside for us. A land of abundance sanctified for his chosen people. The Lord has shown it to me, and it waits now for our faithful feet. He called it the Promised Land, drawing upon biblical imagery that his followers knew intimately. To question such a vision was to question Moses on the mountain. What Isaiah failed to mention, however, was that the land in question had already been purchased months earlier by his brother Samuel. Located near the Hocking River Valley, just outside present-day Logan, Ohio, the parcel was a notorious malaria zone, an area so plagued by seasonal fever that it had been largely abandoned by previous settlers. Swampy, poorly drained, and dense with mosquitoes. During summer months, the tract had been acquired for a fraction of its appraised value. Local landowners had practically given it away, eager to be rid of it. But to Isaiah's congregation, who knew nothing of its lethal history, the land became a sacred inheritance. The vision had spoken, and they would follow. Isaiah's genius was not merely in selling lies, but in selling them as divine revelations wrapped in hope and urgency. Rapid death and denial. By March of that same year, 47 families totaling nearly 200 people had sold their homes, pooled their resources, and followed Isaiah to the Logan settlement. There, with Isaiah's blessing, they began to clear, land construct cabins, and erect a meeting house at the settlement center. Isaiah spoke frequently of divine order, insisting that the homes be arranged in concentric circles around the church, to mirror the celestial pattern of heaven. Days began with communal prayer, and 3 times a week the settlement gathered for long services in which Isaiah elaborated his theology of suffering as sacred purification. Eden, he often reminded them, was not built without labor. nor shall ours be. His presence at first was constant and comforting, but as the swamps thawed and the mosquitoes emerged, things changed. By early June, the first cases of what settlers called the fever appeared initially among the children and the elderly. Within weeks, the illness swept through the population with devastating speed. Symptoms began with chills and aching, quickly escalating to delirium, vomiting, and in many cases, death within days. Still, Isaiah framed the suffering as a divine test. Even the Israelites wandered for 40 years, he reminded them. Are we greater than they? Many settlers clung to this belief, interpreting illness not as environmental hazard, but spiritual challenge. Yet the death toll grew impossible to ignore. By July, they had dug their first cemetery. By August, it held more than 70 graves. The air was thick with rot and mourning. Still, Isaiah insisted the faithful remain. This land was not chosen for the weak, he said. It was chosen for the worthy. Elizabeth Winter's diary. One of the few surviving first-hand accounts of the Logan settlement comes from Elizabeth Winters, wife of Ezekiel Winters, a carpenter and early convert of the Westbrook movement. Her journal, discovered decades later hidden within the walls of her abandoned cabin, offers a harrowing window into the slow unraveling of the community. In her entry, dated August 12, 1805, Elizabeth writes, "Buried little Sarah today. That makes 17 graves this week. The fever takes them so quickly now. Healthy at breakfast, delirious by supper, gone by morning. Ezekiel says this is our trial by fire, but I cannot understand why God would ask for so many innocent lives." Her handwriting, steady at first, deteriorates in later entries, mirroring her mental and emotional descent. I asked if we might return to Milfield, she notes later. Ezekiel says that would mean abandoning our salvation. Reverend Westbrook warned us this would happen. Of particular interest is Elizabeth's account of Samuel Westbrook, who remained behind to manage the community after Isaiah and Daniel returned to Milfield. She describes him as a man more scribe than shepherd, constantly writing in ledgers, taking note of each new grave with a detached precision. He writes each name with the care of a birth record, she observed, but I've never seen him weep. In one haunting entry dated September 3rd, she recounts witnessing Samuel through the cabin window performing calculations the day the Miller family was found dead in their home. 4 more souls for his book. There is no record of Samuel offering prayers, comfort, or burial rites, only bookkeeping. Elizabeth's words are quiet indictments, revealing the chilling inhumanity beneath the Westbrook operation. In her grief, she captured the mechanical nature of their fraud. Profitable collapse. By October 1805, over half the settlement's population was dead. Those who survived were physically broken, emotionally hollowed, and financially ruined. Many abandoned their cabins and attempted to return to nearby towns, but not all made it. Several bodies were later found along the crude dirt roads leading back to civilization, emaciated, fever-stricken, and alone. Those who did reach safety were often met with suspicion. Rumors had begun to spread about the Westbrook sect, and its followers were treated more as members of a doomed cult than victims of a tragedy. Meanwhile, back in Milfield, Isaiah was already preparing his next sermon. Before his congregation, he wept openly for the martyrs of Logan, describing their sacrifice as a sanctification of the land. They walk now in the true promised land, he declared. Their suffering has cleared the way for those who will follow. What Isaiah didn't reveal, what no one outside the inner circle could have known, was that Samuel had already begun reclaiming the abandoned land. Using legal instruments cleverly embedded in the original property agreements, the Westbrooks quietly took back ownership of the cabin's farmland and communal structures. Because the settlers had died without heirs, who were members of the faith or had abandoned the land in breach of covenant, the property reverted to the church, which in practice meant Samuel Westbrook. The family retained the original purchase, money paid by the settlers, and now held the land, again free and clear. Not a dollar was lost. Instead, the brothers prepared to resell the land to timber speculators waiting only for the fever's memory to fade. For the Westbrooks, the Logan settlement was not a failure. It was a profitable test run, and soon they would do it again. Replication of tragedy. The Logan settlement, despite its horrifying outcome, became the prototype for a far more ambitious plan. Between 1805 and 1840, the Westbrook brothers systematically established 15 separate promised land communities across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Each new settlement followed the same macabre template. Isaiah would receive a so-called divine vision identifying a new sacred site. Daniel would compose scripture-like writings to support the spiritual imperative of relocation. And Samuel would acquire the land, draft the contracts, and handle all property logistics. This formula, both theological and financial, was ruthlessly efficient. What looked like inspired leadership from the outside was in fact a perfected model of spiritual exploitation and real estate manipulation. Each new promised land was chosen not for its fertility or accessibility, but for its hidden flaws: malaria-infested wetlands, infertile clay soil, arid plains prone to crop failure, and regions isolated enough to prevent timely rescue or inquiry. The timing of recruitment campaigns was equally strategic. Settlers were shown these lands in autumn when mosquitoes had died off, and the terrain appeared deceptively fertile. Once relocated, the faithful would begin the cycle of construction, farming, and worship, only to be decimated within months by the very landscape they believed was divinely blessed. By the time death and illness spread, Isaiah had often already left for the next phase, and Samuel had prepared to reclaim the land through covenant clauses. It was a system that turned theology into infrastructure, faith into fuel for profit, and suffering into spreadsheet entries. And it worked again and again. Enhanced deception. What allowed the Westbrooks to scale their operation was the sophistication with which they adapted their techniques. After Logan, they began employing more subtle methods of persuasion, expanding the theological narrative to account for losses and refining recruitment to target vulnerable but financially stable individuals. They learned that the language of sacrifice had immense power. By describing illness and death as forms of spiritual refinement, purging the impure and rewarding the devout, they could mask ecological disaster in a cloak of divine intention. In later sermons, Isaiah stopped referring to land as a gift and began framing it as a test. This rhetorical shift reframed suffering not as failure, but as a necessary step toward grace. Doubt became sin. Pain became proof of faith. Daniel, for his part, introduced theological terms like sacred geography, the idea that certain lands, though dangerous, held latent divine power that only the faithful could unlock. This concept allowed him to justify selecting terrain that would logically repel settlers, and yet through careful wording made such locations seem spiritually desirable. The worse the land looked on paper, the more holy it must be. Samuel, always the tactician, modified the covenants to close potential legal loopholes. By 1812, most settlement agreements included clauses that prevented land inheritance outside the faith, locked down resale rights, and ensured automatic reversion of property upon abandonment. These documents were airtight. Even if a settler recognized the danger and tried to leave the church, still retained the land and their investment. It was spiritual indenture masquerading as divine mission, weaponized faith. Perhaps the most disturbing innovation in the Westbrook model was how they weaponized the language of Christianity to suppress dissent and extract consent. The movement's internal culture became increasingly insular, drawing heavily on themes of persecution and divine testing. Critics were labeled agents of doubt. Illness was the refining fire of faith. Entire families were encouraged to remain in deadly conditions under the belief that God was watching, weighing their loyalty. Isaiah frequently cited biblical trials, Job's suffering the Israelites, desert wandering as parallels to their experience. Do not seek the comfort of man, he once preached. Seek the approval of heaven. His charisma ensured that even the most horrific suffering could be spiritualized into endurance. This manipulation extended beyond belief into behavior. Families whose members expressed a desire to leave were gently but firmly rebuked by elders. Those who abandoned settlements were excommunicated and cut off from spiritual support networks, which often included access to food, medical aid, and burial services. Community shame became a tool of control, and those who died in obedience were honored as martyrs. This spiritual framing had material benefits. It kept people in place long enough for the land to be fully paid off, infrastructure to be built, and local death tolls to justify reclamation. Isaiah and Daniel understood the theological levers. Samuel understood the timeline. They weren't just manipulating theology, they were converting it into economic machinery. And the faithful, yearning for purpose in an uncertain world, followed willingly into the valley of death. The Logan template refined. As the years progressed, the brothers not only continued their model, they optimized it. They began factoring seasonal patterns into land selection, choosing areas that looked healthy in the fall but turned deadly by spring. In their fourth settlement near present-day Moran, Ohio, 1810, they selected land that appeared lush during October, but routinely flooded in March, destroying homes and contaminating wells. Prospective settlers were given tours during the dry season, shown healthy livestock, and cleared lots, unaware that within 6 months, disease and hunger would spread like wildfire. In the seventh settlement near western Ohio, 1815, the land boasted dark, rich-looking soil, but it was clay-heavy, drying into a cement-like crust that cracked tools and prevented drainage. By winter, the settlers were trapped, unable to grow crops or escape the brutal conditions. That winter, dozens died from exposure and starvation. Behind the scenes, Samuel compiled data from each site: failure rates, death to reclamation timelines, resale values. Daniel took feedback from each tragedy and infused it into new theological justifications. Isaiah, meanwhile, became more polished, more mythic. His sermons deeper, his delivery more dramatic. He now preached not only from revelation, but from historical proof. The blood of our martyrs consecrates the earth, he once proclaimed to a new group of initiates. They fell that you may rise. This blend of revisionist history and divine narrative made it nearly impossible for followers to see the pattern. Each new promised land felt unique even as it followed a precise and deadly template. Logan had been the beginning, but by 1820 the Westbrooks had turned it into a franchise of failure. Headquarters in Columbus. By the early 1820s, the Westbrooks had grown far beyond scattered settlements and secret contracts. They now ruled over a formal religious institution with regional reach and physical grandeur. At the center of their empire stood a massive church built in Columbus, Ohio. Constructed from locally quarried limestone and adorned with stained glass windows imported from Philadelphia, the structure stood in stark contrast to the humble cabins and makeshift chapels of their frontier settlements. The church's towering steeple, visible for miles, symbolized the movement's growing legitimacy. To outsiders, it was a monument to religious revival. To the initiated, it was the spiritual headquarters of a divine mission. To the Westbrooks, it was an administrative nerve center, a place from which they could command doctrine, redistribute resources, and attract new followers under the guise of faith. Inside its stone walls, Isaiah now delivered sermons to hundreds of congregants, many of whom had never seen a settlement or known anyone who had perished in one. These urban followers, typically wealthier and more socially connected, brought with them something the rural converts had lacked: sustained income through tithes and donations. The Columbus Church offered more than salvation. It provided community stability and upward mobility to newcomers seeking both spiritual and social belonging. While their frontier operations continued in the shadows, the Grand Church in Columbus became a beacon that disguised the death engine running quietly beneath the surface. It gave the Westbrooks a platform to spread influence, gain legal protection, and elevate their reputation far beyond suspicion. Public and private roles. As the movement expanded, each brother settled into a refined persona. Isaiah, now styled Prophet Westbrook, embraced his role as the spiritual visionary. He wore tailored robes, led elaborate ceremonies, and spoke in increasingly apocalyptic tones. His sermons warned of approaching calamities for those who ignored God's calling, and divine blessings for those who obeyed. In this setting, his claims of personal revelation were no longer radical, but revered. He appeared less like a man and more like a biblical archetype wrapped in ritual and reverence. Daniel took the title Apostle of the Scripture and focused on producing a complex, evolving theological canon. His writings now filled volumes, and many of them became mandatory readings in church classes. His prose grew more abstract, relying on layered metaphors and obscure scriptural references, lending his work a mystique that masked its manipulative intentions. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to avoid public attention. While his brothers stood in pulpits and published texts, Samuel managed the financial empire from behind the scenes. Operating from a fortified estate outside Cincinnati, he maintained strict privacy, allowing rumors of spiritual seclusion and deep contemplation to explain his absence. In reality, that estate housed the true engine of the operation, a small army of clerks, accountants, and legal advisors who processed property claims, managed real estate assets, and coordinated the logistics of land turnover and resale. Samuel's reclusiveness was not a spiritual choice, it was a strategic one. His distance insulated him from scandal, protected the financial records, and allowed him to manage the infrastructure like the CEO of a deeply secretive corporation. An expanding network. By 1825, the Westbrook Church boasted over 3,000 active members spread across Ohio and its neighboring states. Interestingly, the majority of these members were not settlement dwellers. Most were everyday congregants who attended regular Sunday services, donated routinely, and accepted the church's teachings without ever being asked to uproot their lives. This broader base of followers offered a crucial element the brothers had previously lacked: legitimacy. The sheer size of the church now provided legal protection, political influence, and the appearance of mainstream respectability. More importantly, it provided a constant influx of new believers, many of whom could be slowly groomed for future settlement selection. This dual-layered structure, the visible church and the hidden machinery, allowed the Westbrooks to compartmentalize risk. The majority of their members were shielded from the horror stories of settlement collapses, while the chosen few were slowly indoctrinated with special doctrines about divine migration and sacred geography. Elders and deacons, hand-picked loyalists, were promoted to oversee these teachings, creating a buffer between the brothers and the dangerous work of relocation. These mid-level leaders were essential. They provided obedience, distributed materials, and enforced order in the name of spiritual discipline. Many believed in the mission with sincere conviction. Others suspected darker truths, but remained silent, incentivized by prestige, or too afraid to confront what lay beneath the surface. With their layers of separation and a growing base of supporters, the Westbrooks were now virtually untouchable. Layers of control and plausible deniability. The genius of the Westbrook system was its hierarchical insulation. At the top stood the brothers, untouched by daily operations and obscured by their roles as prophet, scholar, and recluse. Below them were the elders and deacons who handled recruitment contracts and enforcement. These lieutenants were often deeply loyal, either because they had been elevated from poverty into positions of power, or because they genuinely believed in the divine purpose of the settlements. Beneath them were the regular members, many of whom were unaware of the settlement strategy at all. And at the bottom were the chosen families, those hand-picked to journey to the next promised land. By the time these families realized the danger, they were often isolated, sick, and legally trapped. If a settlement failed, blame could be redirected: poor preparation, natural disaster, even the settlers' own lack of faith. The Westbrooks never appeared on the land. They did not dig graves or sign death certificates. They signed deeds, gave blessings, and collected tithe. Their structure allowed for plausible deniability at every level. It became nearly impossible for any single authority to trace the scheme back to them without testimony from insiders. And since most victims died, fled in shame, or still believed in the mission despite the loss, whistleblowers were rare. The machine had grown too complex to dismantle easily. It had woven itself into the fabric of American religion, just familiar enough to seem credible, just insulated enough to evade consequence. The empire built by the Westbrook brothers now spanned faith, finance, and fear, and it was still growing. A curious visitor from Boston. The unraveling of the Westbrook empire did not begin with a sheriff or a judge, but with a 22-year-old woman named Martha Collins, who arrived in Columbus in the spring of 1838. A well-educated daughter of a prominent Boston attorney, Martha had traveled west to visit her cousin Emma, a recent convert to the Westbrook Church. Martha's upbringing had been unusually progressive for the era her father, William Collins, had ensured she was well versed in literature, property law, and financial bookkeeping. At first, Martha attended services at the Columbus Church out of politeness, but she soon sensed something unsettling beneath the surface. The opulence of the church's interior contrasted sharply with the doctrine of sacrifice preached from the pulpit, and the way Isaiah Westbrook was revered, almost worshipped, struck her as unnatural. She observed subtle patterns that most congregants missed. Families singled out for special recognition seemed to share certain traits, recent inheritances, land sales, or a lack of extended family. The more she watched, the more deliberate it all seemed. Isaiah's sermons, so masterfully delivered, often included calls for certain members to accept new missions or spiritual role. These people were then quietly ushered into settlement recruitment. When she asked Emma about this, her cousin seemed evasive, quoting Daniel Westbrook's writings about sacred assignment. But Martha wasn't deterred. Her background had trained her to spot patterns in contracts and behavior. This wasn't prophecy, it was selection criteria disguised as divine inspiration. And Martha, with quiet determination, resolved to uncover the truth. Entering the inner circle, Martha's breakthrough came when Emma was appointed as a personal assistant to Daniel Westbrook, a position that provided access to the brothers' private offices in Columbus. Playing the part of a wide-eyed devotee, Martha accompanied Emma on errands and quietly memorized the layout of rooms' locks and filing cabinets. Daniel, increasingly dependent on laudanum to manage stress and illness, often left files unattended or allowed Emma to organize his correspondence. Martha seized the opportunity. In May of 1838, while Emma was busy cataloging church sermons, Martha used a borrowed key to open a locked cabinet in Daniel's study. Inside, she found maps of every known settlement, annotated with notes about disease cycles, terrain failure, and projected mortality rates. Even more disturbing were the death records ledgers of names, ages, property values, and dates of death. In the margins were calculations of anticipated asset recovery and resale estimates. One document titled Selection Criteria for Covenant Families outlined how to identify targets, those with liquid assets, no surviving extended family, and minimal legal complexity. These weren't tragic losses. They were forecasts, inventory lists. Martha realized the scope of what she had found. The Westbrooks were not simply misguided spiritual leaders. They were orchestrators of industrial-scale death using divine authority to strip people of their wealth, dignity, and lives. For the first time in decades, someone had the evidence to expose the truth. A hollowed Bible and a dangerous plan. Over the course of several nights, Martha painstakingly copied pages, by hand reproducing maps, death ledgers, and theological documents with the precision of a trained clerk. She hid the notes inside a hollowed-out Bible, a deeply ironic hiding place for evidence of religious mass murder. Her plan was to return to Boston and hand the information to her father, who had close connections with federal authorities and U.S. Senator Daniel Webster. But as the day of her departure approached, Martha noticed subtle changes in how people behaved around her. Church members who had once been friendly became overly inquisitive. She noticed unfamiliar men loitering near her boarding house. Emma, once carefree, now reported that Daniel had been asking questions about Martha's routines. Sensing she had been discovered, Martha wrote a final letter to her father. "If anything happens to me," she wrote, "know this, the Westbrooks are not men of God. They are merchants of death. Their promised lands are grave sites disguised as covenants. She described her plan to flee on a stagecoach headed to Pittsburgh and concealed the letter in her room. On the evening of May 17, 1838, Martha was last seen near the station, intercepted by two men in dark coats. A witness reported seeing her enter a church-owned carriage. She was never seen again. Days later, letters appeared claiming that Martha had left for Illinois on a spiritual assignment. Handwriting analysts would later determine they were forgeries likely written by Daniel. The Westbrooks had silenced their greatest threat, the father who wouldn't let go. Martha's disappearance would have become just another Westbrook mystery, whispered, dismissed, forgotten, if not for her father, William Collins. Upon receiving no direct word from his daughter, he traveled to Columbus himself. Unlike the settlers, the Westbrooks usually exploited. Collins was a man of status, wealth, and legal acumen. A seasoned attorney with ties to Boston's political elite, he wasted no time launching his own private investigation. He rented a home near the Columbus Church and began methodically interviewing current and former members. Offering generous financial rewards for information, he gathered more details in a month than authorities had managed in a decade. The veil of divine mystery began to unravel under the light of hard cash and legal scrutiny. As Collins pieced together accounts of disappearing families, suspicious contracts, and coded theological language, he connected with a crucial informant, Jacob Miller, a longtime deacon whose own daughter and grandchildren had recently perished in a Westbrook settlement. Devastated and disillusioned, Miller provided confirmation of Martha's findings and revealed the existence of a master ledger kept beneath the pulpit of the original Milfield church, the so-called accounting. According to Miller, the brothers believed this document justified their actions before God, tallying not just deaths and deeds, but divine purpose. Isaiah sees redemption. Daniel sees theology, Samuel sees prophet, Miller told Collins. But it's all there in the accounting. Every name, every dollar, every grave. Armed with this knowledge, William Collins prepared to do what no one else had: confront the Westbrooks in full daylight, with the law, the press, and the truth. The master ledger, the accounting. With Jacob Miller's insider testimony in hand, William Collins now had the final piece of the puzzle: confirmation that a master ledger referred to by insiders as the accounting existed and contained the full extent of the Westbrooks' crimes. According to Miller, the document was more than a financial record, it was a spiritual testament. Isaiah reportedly believed the ledger served a dual purpose on earth as a record of property acquisitions and settlement outcomes, in heaven as a divine audit of obedience and sacrifice. To Daniel, it was a sacred text in its own right, justifying their theological framework. But to Samuel, the accounting was purely transactional, a precise documentation of losses converted into land tithes and resale income. Every entry was a death monetized. Miller claimed that Samuel reviewed it weekly, using its data to project future settlement sites, optimize mortality curves, and time real estate reclamations. The ledger, Miller said, was kept beneath the pulpit of the original Milfield church, which had since been converted into a ceremonial site. The church, once central to the faith's origin, now served as a shrine where few dared enter, perhaps intentionally. It was rumored to be spiritually sacred, and access was restricted to inner circle members. Collins, understanding its symbolic and legal value, arranged with Governor Wilson Shannon to initiate a discreet but coordinated multi-site raid, targeting the Columbus headquarters, the Cincinnati estate and the Milfield church on December 18, 1838. The goal was to seize financial records, expose the hierarchy's true assets, and recover the accounting before the Westbrooks could disappear again. But what Collins couldn't predict was that someone had warned the brothers first. Fires of purification. Just days before the planned raid, a sympathizer inside the governor's office tipped off the Westbrooks. What followed was a dramatic and deliberate purge of evidence thinly veiled as a church-wide purification ritual. For 3 days, bonfires roared across Westbrook properties in Ohio. Members were told it was a symbolic cleansing, a burning of doubt, sin, and spiritual distraction. In truth, it was a mass destruction of incriminating evidence. Files were carted out of the Cincinnati estate under Samuel's supervision, loaded into wagons, and sent to undisclosed locations. Witnesses reported seeing armed men guard the transports. In Columbus, Daniel High on laudanum burned stacks of theological drafts and handwritten correspondence. The most dramatic scene unfolded in Milfield, where Isaiah himself led a team of loyal followers into the original church under cover of darkness. Acting on an anonymous tip, Sheriff Thomas Redfield arrived at the Milfield church just as Isaiah attempted to extract the accounting from beneath the pulpit. A tense standoff followed. When the sheriff demanded the document, Isaiah refused. In the chaos that followed, 2 church members were killed, and Isaiah was wounded, shot in the shoulder, as he tried to flee with the ledger. Ultimately, he escaped, and the accounting vanished once more. Redfield later reported that the church floorboards had been ripped open and the hiding place was empty. This confrontation broadcast in newspapers as the prophet's flight triggered a full-blown manhunt, with Collins hiring private detectives and federal marshals joining the pursuit. The Westbrook empire was crumbling, and now for the first time the public could see it. The Westbrook Exodus. What came next was a chaotic unraveling now known in newspapers of the era as the Westbrook Exodus. Over the course of the winter of 1838-1839, the brothers liquidated as many assets as they could and fled south with approximately 60 loyal followers. Their route wound through Kentucky and Tennessee, dodging both bounty hunters and lawmen. William Collins, relentless in his pursuit, worked in tandem with law enforcement to track their movements. Investigators uncovered new evidence along the way: contracts, settlement maps, and even plans to establish colonies in Texas and Central America. One cache, found in a Nashville hotel room, included outlines for targeting German and Scandinavian immigrants under the assumption they would be less suspicious of harsh terrain and less aware of American property law. The brothers' methods had grown more sophisticated over time, and so had their escape strategy. They traveled under false names, used church funds to bribe local officials, and split up for periods to avoid detection. Samuel, ever the strategist, seemed to be managing the logistics. Isaiah, increasingly erratic and wounded, alternated between prayer and panic. Daniel, disoriented and addicted to opiates, often rambled in sermons that no one recorded. Despite the chaos, they remained focused on reaching New Orleans, where they hoped to secure passage abroad, perhaps to Cuba or even Europe. But their unity was fracturing. Witnesses later testified that by the time they reached Natchez, Mississippi, the brothers were no longer speaking. Samuel had begun transferring funds to accounts outside the church network, and Isaiah, once the unshakable prophet, was heard whispering, "The Lord has hidden his face from me." The deaths at the dock. On March 12, 1839, the Westbrook story came to its dramatic public climax on the docks of New Orleans. Local police records describe an altercation near the waterfront involving two well-dressed white men and a group of dock workers. Gunfire erupted. By the time officers arrived, both Isaiah and Daniel were dead. Isaiah shot twice in the chest. Daniel found slumped over a crate bleeding from a head wound. The official explanation recorded it as a merchant dispute turned violent, but many suspect otherwise. Some historians believe it was an extrajudicial execution carried out by detectives or federal agents who feared a public trial might reveal the full scope of how the Westbrooks operated so freely for so long. Others believe vigilantes among the victims' families orchestrated the event. No charges were filed. A dock worker, later interviewed by a New Orleans journalist, claimed that Isaiah died clutching a small leather-bound book to his chest. It looked like a Bible, he said, but it had brass corners and was locked shut. The book was never recovered. His reported last words were chilling. "Our work is recorded in heaven. You cannot erase what we have built." Daniel's body, when examined, bore signs of old injuries, including healed rib fractures and a broken finger, likely from years of physical altercations or restraint. The deaths of the two most visible brothers stunned their followers, but the final chapter of the Westbrook saga remained unwritten. For Samuel Westbrook, the most elusive and calculating of the trio, was still alive. And somewhere, perhaps carrying the last piece of the puzzle, he was on the run. Samuel's vanishing act. While Isaiah and Daniel met violent ends on the New Orleans docks, Samuel Westbrook simply disappeared. His escape was no accident. It was the product of foresight and calculated distancing. Unlike his brothers, Samuel had long remained in the background, keeping his name off property records, rarely appearing in public sermons, and operating through layers of legal proxies. Witnesses last saw him in Natchez, Mississippi, boarding a separate steamboat carrying luggage and a forged passport under the name Samuel West. According to testimony from a former follower, Samuel had already begun transferring the church's wealth into private accounts in New Orleans and Havana, and had secured letters of introduction for business relocation in Latin America. While Isaiah clung to the illusion of divine rescue, Samuel prepared for survival. Multiple sightings of Samuel Westbrook, or men matching his description, surfaced in the following years from Mexico City to Havana, even Lisbon. The most credible trace came from São Paulo, Brazil, where police records from 1847 document the arrest of an American named Samuel West, accused of running a fraudulent religious colony. The details were eerily familiar. Followers, recruited with promises of Holy Land property deeds, signed over to a church, and members dying from exposure, malnutrition, and disease. Though the suspect died in custody before trial, reportedly from self-administered poison, Brazilian officials confiscated a journal from his belongings. That journal, now in the hands of archivists, includes lines such as, "My brothers lacked vision. They saw our work as confined to America, so I see the world." If the handwriting is authenticated, it may be the final proof that Samuel Westbrook survived and continued his deadly work abroad. The scale of the crime. Even without his formal confession, the scale of the Westbrooks' crimes became increasingly clear in the years following their downfall. Investigators estimated that between 7,000 and 9,000 deaths could be directly attributed to their settlement model across 15 known promised lands. That number does not include deaths that occur during attempted escapes from related illness or from psychological trauma experienced by survivors. The scheme had weaponized nearly every vulnerable aspect of frontier life: geographical isolation, lack of legal oversight, deep religious longing, and the constitutional protections of religious freedom. They had used faith as a lure, death as a currency, and salvation as a sales pitch. Their genius was in the systematization. Every element was meticulously recorded, reviewed, and adapted for greater efficiency. What might have remained scattered cult activity instead evolved into a scalable operation, one that masqueraded as revivalist Christianity, while functioning like a death-fueled land speculation syndicate. The accounting ledger, never recovered in full, was said to contain predictions for future mortality rates, expected yields from property seizures, and detailed demographic breakdowns of high-value targets. E-settlers with liquid assets, poor health, and minimal family. This wasn't only spiritual exploitation, it was capitalized human suffering. It remains to this day one of the most complex religious frauds in American history, so effective, so polished, that it succeeded for decades without triggering public alarm. Legal ripples and moral reckonings. The exposure of the Westbrook scheme shook the state of Ohio and rippled into national consciousness. In the wake of the scandal, state legislators passed what became known as the Westbrook Regulations, a series of laws requiring financial transparency for religious organizations, mandatory oversight of religious land holdings, and legal reviews of faith-based property transfers. These regulations set precedents across other states in the following decades. The laws were designed not to inhibit religious practice, but to protect vulnerable individuals from coercion masked as divine command. For the first time, American lawmakers were forced to grapple with the tension between religious liberty and public safety, a question that remains alive to this day. Civil courts also became involved. A number of surviving families and former followers filed claims against the remaining assets of the Westbrook Church, some of which were held in trust by loyal elders unaware of the full scheme. In 1845, the Ohio legislature authorized limited restitution payments based on the records preserved in the Westbrook Victims Registry, established by William Collins and Jacob Miller. Though the payments were symbolic compared to the lives lost and wealth stolen, they represented the first official state recognition of the atrocity. Legal scholars today point to the Westbrook case as an early example of how fraud cloaked in religious freedom can evade detection unless structural protections are in place. Their operation was a theological parasite that infected the legal and moral systems of early America. Psychological fallout and cultural haunting. Beyond legislation and restitution, the psychological aftermath of the Westbrook conspiracy would linger for generations. Survivors of the settlements described decades of nightmares, guilt, and spiritual confusion. Many could no longer enter a church without trembling. Entire families disappeared from public life, their names associated with cultic tragedy. The original Logan settlement remained abandoned for nearly 50 years. Locals reported ghost sightings, strange lights, and an oppressive heaviness around the burial grounds. In the 1890s, workers refused to dig foundations within 100 yards of the old cemetery. Whether or not one believes in hauntings, the psychological stain of what had happened was real and pervasive. Elements of Westbrook theology. Particularly the covenants of faith and chosen land doctrines persisted in obscure religious movements for decades. Some were recycled by later cult leaders. In the 1980s, authorities in Montana uncovered a community whose founding documents copied sections word for word from Daniel Westbrook's writings. Though no formal connection was established, scholars began identifying what they called the Westbrook pattern: charismatic leadership, isolated locations, asset consolidation, and spiritual framing of suffering. The Westbrooks may have died, but their methods did not. They became an archetype of religious abuse, a cautionary tale buried beneath decades of dust and fire, but never truly forgotten. The legacy of Martha Collins. Though she vanished before she could testify, Martha Collins became the unofficial martyr of the Westbrook investigation. Her disappearance was never officially solved, but her notes, copied documents, and the final unsent letter were critical in building a case that exposed the movement's true nature. Her father, William Collins, poured the remainder of his fortune into the cause, funding legal efforts, public education campaigns, and victim restitution projects. In 1851, he established the Martha Collins Foundation, dedicated to investigating religious fraud and supporting survivors of spiritual exploitation. It was the first organization of its kind in the United States. For decades, the foundation funded covert investigations into suspect religious groups long before the concept of cults entered the public lexicon. Emma Collins, Martha's cousin and one-time insider, became an outspoken critic of the Westbrook legacy. Overwhelmed by guilt for her unintentional role in Martha's death, she testified in multiple court proceedings and eventually founded a shelter for women leaving religious cults in Columbus, a revolutionary institution in the 19th century. Her writings, preserved in a collection titled The Faithful and the Deceived, offer rare emotional insight into the internal lives of Westbrook followers. Emma's voice added a layer of human complexity to the case, reminding future generations that not all who obey are complicit and not all who question are safe. Together, Martha and Emma became historical counterpoints. One vanished into myth, the other lived to bear witness. Their intertwined fates stand as a haunting footnote to a conspiracy built on silence and submission, unearthed graves and lingering evidence. Though the Westbrook records were mostly destroyed, fragments continued to resurface across the decades. In 1890, a farmer near the original Logan settlement discovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 40 individuals, including 27 children. Their skeletal remains bore signs of disease, malnutrition, and hasty burial, consistent with Elizabeth Winter's diary. Entries from 1805, the layout of the site, confirmed earlier testimonies: no spacing, no ceremony, just efficiency. The discovery reignited public discussion of the Westbrook crimes, prompting renewed interest in the movement from historians, journalists, and theologians alike. In 1923, renovations to an old Columbus church building uncovered a hidden compartment containing partial property records and settlement maps, now archived at the Ohio State Archives. These documents revealed a system of coded language used in internal correspondence, phrases like seedbed of faith and refining fire that denoted high-risk land plots. And in 1998, an antique desk sold at a Cincinnati estate auction was found to contain a false bottom, hiding what appeared to be Samuel Westbrook's journal from 1830-1832. Still undergoing verification, The journal hints at the brothers' expansion into other criminal enterprises, including insurance fraud and identity laundering concepts shockingly advanced for the time. These documents not only confirmed old suspicions, but revealed that the Westbrooks' ambitions may have been even broader than previously believed. The Westbrook pattern in modern cults. What makes the Westbrook conspiracy uniquely relevant today is how its tactics continue to echo in modern cult dynamics. Religious scholars and sociologists have documented iterations of the Westbrook pattern in movements around the world. The formula is tragically simple and enduring: a charismatic leader with claims of divine authority, geographic isolation of members, transfer of assets through religious covenants or spiritual pledges, and the spiritualization of suffering to suppress dissent. These patterns, though often updated for new technologies or cultural contexts, retain the same emotional and psychological leverage the Westbrooks perfected 2 centuries ago. In particular, the manipulative use of property law remains a core tactic in modern exploitative groups. The Westbrooks pioneered this under the guise of religious devotion, a precedent that has reappeared in groups ranging from isolated communes to multinational cults. Scholars credit the legal frameworks born from the Westbrook case, especially the Ohio regulations on faith-based land holdings, as the first major American effort to draw a line between religious freedom and financial abuse. Today, these lines are still debated in courts around the world, particularly when spiritual institutions use tax exemptions, donation structures, or non-disclosure agreements to avoid scrutiny. The Westbrooks may be long dead, but their system lives on in shadow. A cautionary tale for a free society. The story of the Westbrook brothers is not simply one of historical horror. It is a mirror reflecting the perils of uncritical belief and the dangers of unchecked authority. In a nation built on religious liberty, the brothers found a way to transform sacred trust into economic machinery. They didn't use swords or armies. They used scriptures, sermons, and signatures. Their rise was made possible not only by their cunning, but by the systemic blind spots of a young country, its lack of oversight, its hunger for spiritual order, and its reverence for personal conviction. Their downfall was not inevitable. It required a woman who saw the lie, a father who refused to let go, and a system finally forced to look at the rot beneath its own idealism. Today, the remains of Westbrook settlements are overgrown, their churches demolished, their names absent from official histories. But their impact remains visible in law, psychology, and theology. Their story serves as both a warning and a responsibility to never allow belief to be weaponized against the vulnerable, to question those who claim absolute authority, and to recognize that evil rarely announces itself with horns. Sometimes it wears robes, speaks in scripture, and promises you heaven while mapping your grave. The promised lands they sold were never about salvation. They were about control. And remembering them is how we ensure no one else calls a killing field sacred ground again.